Since Alcock and Brown's landmark transatlantic flight landed in the west of Ireland nearly a century ago, Ireland has managed to maintain a pivotal position in the world of flight. It has been a long and at times challenging journey, but today, Ireland is a truly global centre for the aviation industry. But by the mid-70s, the focus of this multi-billion business was beginning to move increasingly from the airfield into the boardroom.
A very large proportion of the aircraft that fly around the world, many of them are owned in Ireland and managed by people who work here in Ireland.
Ireland's now, the largest single place in the world that manages leasing of aircraft.
Over 1,000 airplanes have been ordered by Ireland. So yeah, it has huge impact in the world.
In 1936, a man was born into a humble railway cottage here at Limerick Junction. 20 years later, he would go to work with Aer Lingus at Shannon Airport.
I was walking up the corridor, and this young guy, that's all I could describe him, came down towards me with a suitcase. And he said, "Excuse me." He said, "Would you know where the Aer Lingus office is?" So I said, "Come on, I'll show you." Back down into the Tony Ryan.
In the mid-50s, Tony Ryan arrived at Shannon just as the Irish aviation industry was beginning to blossom. Shannon and Dublin airports were thriving while a new airport was opened in Cork in 1957. Aer Lingus, now a growing symbol of national pride, was also about to launch its first transatlantic flights. Over the next 2 decades, Ryan moved up through the ranks of the airline, and in 1972 he returned to Ireland after a period as station manager at New York's JFK Airport. But now international aviation was in crisis amidst a global recession, while Irish travel and tourism was badly affected by the troubles in the north of Ireland. During the bleak winter months, Ireland's national carrier found itself with too many aircraft on the ground, and Ryan was tasked with the job of offloading some of them, at least temporarily.
We just got the 747s. We'd had a large fleet of 707s and 737s. And I was given the chore of finding temporary homes for them. The 737s we leased into Canada. The 707s we leased into Lebanon and Israel. And the 747 we sent to Thailand for 3 years to a company called Air Siam.
In a real sense, this marked the birth of aircraft leasing as a major international business. In the years to come, Tony Ryan, along with American Stephen Udvar-Hazy, would be seen as the father of aviation leasing.
There was no leasing until Tony Ryan conceptually came up with the concept. And he actually brought the leasing industry to Ireland.
Ryan's success within Aer Lingus alerted him to the business opportunities for leasing internationally.
At the time, I put a proposal to Aer Lingus, and it was turned down as not being practical. And then I decided that I would resign and set up my own company.
Amidst a bleak economic time in Ireland, the Shannon region remained a beacon of industrial and social development. And it was here in 1975 that Tony Ryan chose to locate his new aircraft leasing company called Guinness Peat Aviation, GPA, with investment from Guinness Peat and his long-standing employer, Aer Lingus.
It's a winner for everybody. It's good for Tony Ryan, but it's also good for Aer Lingus. They recognise his skill, his expertise. He'd become almost a legend overnight in getting rid of the original jumbo jet on lease. So they know that he's somebody who's talented, that he's probably going to go off and do this thing by himself, but instead they invest in the company, and going forward it becomes something which they work on together.
The Shannon Free Zone, beyond the perimeter of the airport, was a vast industrial park established in 1959, which attracted international multinationals and smaller local companies who enjoyed its favourable tax benefits. Shannon Airport, however, was aware that it could no longer depend on the Shannon stopover, the 1945 agreement with the US that ensured their planes would stop in Shannon. Technical advances in jet engines meant that it was no longer necessary to land there, and US authorities were arguing that it would prevent Aer Lingus flying to the United States unless the Shannon stopover clause was revoked. To survive, Shannon needed to look for other business. With the Cold War now at its height, Shannon did something that it had never done before. It turned eastwards, and the Soviet carrier Aeroflot began flying through Shannon en route to the US and on to Latin America.
We all looked on Russia as maybe it's very far away, but in reality Moscow was only 4 hours away, much less than New York, but it seemed to be the other end of the world altogether. My ex-boss rang me to know would I consider coming and work for Aeroflot. And 'twas the time of the Cold War, you know. So I said, God, I don't know, you know. But I went on it. So I spent 10 years with the Russians. They were a great crowd to work with, you know. And in character, something like ourselves, like the old vodka. And I got a good grounding on that, mind you. Passed, I think, with flying honours. We had a guarantee at the time that we would have 300 flights a year, but in the first year we had something like 500, and gradually it extended from that, and within 10 years we had 3,000 flights a year.
By 1980, an arrangement was made to ship lower-cost Russian fuel into Shannon to refuel Aeroflot planes. And soon the airport struck a unique bartering agreement enabling them to sell the cheaper fuel onto other airlines in exchange for airport services.
There was one of the charter operators coming through, and they were told that Shannon had this fuel, and he said, "What's the origin of this fuel?" And they said, "Russian." "Oh, gee," he said. No. He said, "What price are you?" Well, just about maybe 5 or 10 cents. "Listen," he said, "pour it, but don't tell us where it is from." So they knew what we were doing. Another interesting one was Caspar Weinberger was Secretary of Defense, and he came through a few times, and he'd always look for Smirnoff vodka. He said his wife liked it, but he said, "Will you put it in a bag for me?" Really, that, you know, he'd say, "Oh, we're buying the Russian stuff." But so there didn't seem to be much resentment.
By now, GPA was beginning to thrive, and Tony Ryan had recruited a dynamic team of executives.
To have a leasing company in County Clare and, well, the west of Ireland was quite strange. You would expect it to be in New York or London or Los Angeles. But my very first meeting, there were just the 6 founder members and me. I was just a new person, so I kept quiet. And they were talking about an airline that there was a prospect. And Tony Ryan suddenly turned to me for the very first time and said, "You know, Graham, I'd nearly send them a telex." Well, I wasn't used to Irish phraseology, so I said, "Well, when you say you nearly send them a telex, how close exactly are you to sending it?" And Tony Ryan just sat back in his seat and looked across at Peter Swift, who'd hired me, and went, "Gobshite." That was my first conversation with Tony.
I was home for Christmas and I was in the buttery bar of the Hibernian Hotel, and I met Tony Ryan, who I'd known from Aer Lingus, obviously. And he said to me, "When are you coming back to Ireland to work for GPA?" And I said, "Tony, you couldn't afford me." And of course, that Tony, who was terribly competitive, was like red rag to a bull.
And he started out by saying to me, "But sure, you know nothing about the commercial world. All you know about is diplomacy and a lot of nonsense." And he said, "You've never sold a calf in Tipperary Fair or in Limerick Fair." And I said, "Well, I was selling pigs in Macroom Fair when I was 5 years old." And that caught his attention.
I joined at GPA on a Monday. I came into the office on Tuesday morning, was told I had to be in Bangladesh that evening, so I had to rush home and pack my bag and get in a plane and go to Bangladesh to try and lease a DC-10 to Bangladesh Biman.
GPA's ongoing relationship with Aer Lingus was vital to the company's initial success, affording them respectability and, crucially, giving them access to virtually free air travel as a result of a long-standing arrangement between airlines.
In those days, airlines would let colleagues from other airlines fly free or for 10%, or maximum would be for 50% of the fare. Now, if you think that GPA started up with £30,000 equity, if you were buying air tickets at full fare, you wouldn't be able to make many trips. And in my opinion, that was absolutely crucial to the early months and years of GPA.
That's what people working in GPA early on are doing. They're going all around the world, drumming up business, traveling hundreds and hundreds of thousands of miles every year, so that, as people would always say, you know, you could rock up to almost anywhere in the world and you'd find Tony Ryan sitting on his suitcase in an airport, drumming up business.
But no matter where they were in the world, GPA executives were expected to fly back to Shannon for an early Monday morning meeting.
Nothing is more legendary in GPA circles than the Monday morning meeting, and almost nothing has more BS associated with it than the Monday morning meeting. The rows and the bollockings which took place in that meeting get more vociferous, louder, more dramatic as every year passes since they took place.
Yeah, I think I was the person who made the phrase "blood on the walls," and there certainly was blood on the walls on a Monday morning.
But one of the great legends about the Monday morning meetings was that Tony would fly into a rage, that there would be shouting. In fact, when you talk to the core people in GPA who were there for a long time, what they will always tell you is that Tony Ryan's rage was always at its worst when he was quiet, even silent. That it was the cold look that would terrify.
He just cross-examined everybody and at times humiliated them. But it drove everybody on, it worked.
A Tipperary native, Ryan's vision for the region didn't stop at the doors of GPA, however. He saw the Shannon Free Zone as a major industrial hub, and he invested heavily in other ancillary ventures.
You don't hear much about Shannon Aerospace now, but Shannon Aerospace is a substantial, and was a substantial entity, which was bringing significant employment to the Shannon area in aircraft maintenance, basically. This was a massive interest of his. It was in no sense an interest in making money out of it. In fact, it was seen potentially as quite the opposite, a drag on his finances. I don't think that that was ever his motivation. Certainly it was nothing, not that I was enormously close to him, but I did see a fair bit of him for a time. And his interest was Ireland Inc.
The long-standing tradition of technical excellence fostered by Aer Lingus in both Dublin and Shannon was also a major factor in the industry's growing success.
All roads lead back to Aer Lingus, and you know, Aer Lingus being a national icon, being one of the first national airlines in the world. And what that did is it enabled Ireland to create some really good talent and develop a very good technical heritage. So between the Aer Lingus technical side and the apprenticeships and the Irish Air Corps, a lot of technically qualified people were created. it's really critical. Even if you look at a modern leasing company, without good technical people to monitor and manage the condition of those aircraft, you can very quickly look at some significant losses. So they become quite critical to any of the organisations today in aviation.
By the early 80s, the need for deregulation in the airline business was becoming increasingly evident across the world. In America, lower fares were becoming the norm as independent airlines began to flourish.
Tony Ryan looks at aviation in Ireland and realises that there is an untapped market, that Ireland is out of sync with the rest of the world.
There had previously been various attempts to launch independent airlines in Ireland, all with differing levels of success, such as Iona, Avair, Air Ireland, and Tony Ryan's own Airlandia. But Ryan, now a wealthy man as a result of GPA, decided to set up an airline to be operated by his 3 sons. Ryanair was born, and the new airline made its maiden flight out of Waterford in 1985.
It cost £500 to travel between Dublin and London at a time when the average industrial wage was probably £15,000, £20,000 a year. And that was a very bad position to have for the Irish economy, one, and for consumers, secondly. So you kind of had the conditions in place to induce and encourage competition.
So I remember Ryanair from the very earliest days, flying between, Waterford and the UK. I remember playing golf in Wexford and seeing the aircraft flying overhead. So I can remember it from the very beginning. But I think there was always this quite a cynical view taken to Ryanair within Aer Lingus, that it was never going to succeed. It was a castle built on sand. It would all come crashing down.
The response of Aer Lingus and of the department and of the government at the time was to publish this air transport bill. They made it a criminal offence, punishable by a fine of £100,000 and/or imprisonment for 2 years if you discounted a fare by even £1 below the approved fixed figure approved by Aer Lingus and the department.
Stand by, please. Runway 35.
The changing attitude towards regulation in the EU and public disquiet about the cost of fares, allied to the intervention of Desi O'Malley, a friend of Ryan and then an independent TD, eventually persuaded the government that Ryanair should be granted a licence to fly into Luton.
Pipers called a tune for Ryanair's first flight from Dublin to Luton. Ryanair would claim that before putting a single plane on the route, they managed to bring down airfares sharply. But that contention is hotly disputed by the major carriers like Aer Lingus and British Airways, which starts a new service from Cork to Manchester tomorrow, and Dan Air. They say cross-channel airfares were already on the downward trend.
At the helm of the new company was an extrovert young managing director, Eugene O'Neill, who appeared to embody the spirit of the new enterprise. By now, GPA's profits were soaring.
By 1985, I think we probably had something like 45 aircraft, which we thought was a terrific growth in 10 years. But by 1991, we had over 400 aircraft. I mean, we were taking at one point 90 brand new aircraft a year.
The key to his success, it seems to me, is that he never allowed himself to stand still, and he never allowed anyone else to stand still either.
Each year was more incredible than the previous year. It was a very strange existence, and Tony had these objectives that we just thought were outrageous. But we hit them.
He tells a story about GPA getting a debt facility of 3.5 billion to purchase aircraft. And somebody came up to him and said, "Mr. Ryan, I'm very sorry for your trouble that you have to borrow so much money." And he thought this was great, that the banks had such faith, and he was going to buy, 70 aircraft.
Amidst dark days for employment in 1980s Ireland, GPA continued to recruit a younger wave of dynamic executives.
Here you had this oasis of, a glamorous business, leasing $30 million airplanes. It was a very new business. Most people in Ireland, I don't think, had even heard of aircraft leasing.
Leaving a meeting in somewhere or others, and we both looked at each other and said, "Isn't it great that two young fellas at the time from the west of Ireland, both of us from the west of Ireland, were able to go to this meeting in Hong Kong and look eye to eye with these high financiers," and that was a great thing. So that confidence and that sense of that you can do this.
The prospect of being able to travel and meet airlines and assist initially, and then hopefully one day be able to cook one's own deals on something as exciting as an airplane. That was very exciting.
This place was just dynamic beyond belief. And I remember the trading floor. This is long before trading floors were de rigueur. These screens, and we could pull up aircraft serial numbers anywhere in the world. I mean, this was Star Trek.
But while GPA continued to thrive internationally, back home, the fledgling Ryanair was losing money hand over fist.
Like, I've heard stories about they would come in on a Monday and there was a pile of invoices on the desk, and they would take out the 5 at the bottom and pay those and leave the rest pile up during the week, and every Monday was like that.
You have to remember that Aer Lingus was effectively an arm of the government. So we weren't just fighting Aer Lingus, we were fighting the government as well. And it became very, very difficult.
It was very hard to explain to people then that there were things happening that would have, at that time, been criminal offences in America. But they didn't see anything wrong with them here. And one of them was Aer Lingus paying £500,000 a year to KLM to stay out of Ireland. It was a way of keeping up their own fare levels, but not to have any competition. And of course, the way the cartel with British Airways worked was that they shared the proceeds at the end of the year. So it didn't really matter if one was losing out a bit to the other. They shared out equally anyway. And only that Tony Ryan had become, I suppose, quite a wealthy man by that stage due to the success of GPA in Shannon. His pockets were sufficiently deep to be able to keep Ryanair in existence.
But as things went from bad to worse with Ryanair, Tony Ryan appointed the experienced PJ McGoldrick as CEO in 1988 and sent his young personal assistant, a trained accountant, in to look at the books. His name was Michael O'Leary, and so began a journey which would change Irish and European aviation utterly. By 1989, Seamus Brennan, then Minister for Transport, became convinced that increasing competition in the airline business was in the national interest. Ryanair was now able to expand its flights into Britain.
When we started to operate directly to Stansted, we now had an airport that was a serious offering for passengers travelling on the Dublin-London route, which was and still is one of the busiest international routes of the world. So we were right to the pin of our collars. We were living from hand to mouth. It was a very tenuous existence. The Ryans had put in £20 million of their own money, which was an enormous sum of money at that time, and there was no more coming. In fact, the Bank of Ireland cut off our overdraft facility. So we were really sailing very, very close to the wind.
By the early 1990s, Guinness Pete Aviation was on the crest of a wave. They had, in part at least, written the rulebook of international aviation leasing, and now had commitments of over $9 billion. In 1992, amidst huge expectation, GPA was finally launched on the stock market.
I remember it well for a number of reasons. I was doing a master's degree in Trinity College. A lot of people were talking about GPA. It was a big story in Irish business circles, not just in Irish aviation circles, but in business circles. This was going to be a very big event.
But as the flotation approached, the indications were ominous. The global economy was on the verge of spiraling downwards while the first Gulf War raged in Iraq. Tony Ryan, however, remained optimistic.
His bankers are saying, this isn't looking good. And he tells them in the starkest language possible that he doesn't believe this. He doesn't quite put it as politely as that. And he tells them to get out there and sell this thing.
I think Tony was very caught up in a prospect of doing a hugely successful IPO. And he insisted on pricing the IPO above the level which the market would allow.
I think, Tony was perhaps not as familiar with those markets as he needed to be, and felt that he could bully them and push them to give him what he wanted, and these guys weren't for moving.
Well, certainly at my level, which was relatively junior at the time, we would have anticipated success. There was a strong feeling that this is going to work. This is going to get away.
We were aware of the challenges, not intimately, but with fundamental belief we'd overcome them. And, the reality of that belief translated into pretty much everybody in that company owning shares. And not stock options, buying the shares.
It was to launch in 3 cities, I recall. And it launched in Tokyo first, and it went well. But when it came to London, it didn't. It bombed, I think is the phrase.
As the long night of the flotation wore on, it became increasingly clear that this was one battle that Tony Ryan would not win.
He had to go to the hotel, shower, and just almost immediately go and announce to the world that this company, GPA, that the party was over.
This morning, Dr. Tony Ryan's dream of having the largest Irish company quoted on the stock exchange turned into a nightmare.
He said that he thought he should tell me that I was industry and commerce, I think, at the time, to tell the government that it just wasn't going to work now, and that he'd have to sit down and think how best to salvage the situation. I felt very sorry for him, and I remember talking to him that day.
Within hours of the failed flotation, GPA's value crashed. News slowly filtered out to other, more junior GPA staff, some of whom had borrowed heavily, expecting a huge windfall.
I mean, I can still vividly remember the day the flotation failed. I mean, I can see it, and I can remember a colleague of ours. We worked in a team called GPA Capital, which is kind of like the financial structuring team, and I remember he came out onto the floor and said it was off, and I remember he kind of said, well, how do you mean it's off? I mean, like, how could that be?
I called NCB stockbrokers in Dublin. And I said, I want to sell my shares. And they said, there's no market. And then I called my mother.
I don't think people realised what the final ramifications would be, that effectively the company would be wound down over the next year and a bit.
By now it was clear that GPA was no longer in charge of its own destiny.
Would you welcome, please, the chairman, executive chairman of GPA, Dr. Tony Ryan. I'm pleased to meet you, Tony. Give us a rundown, please, on how GPA fareth today.
We've had 17 years of extraordinary fortune and great opportunity. The setback in June of the IPO being rejected was a shock, and the shock waves, I think, are still through the company.
Our fundamental business is still extraordinarily good and profitable. As you said, we have many aircraft in many countries overseas, and there's a tremendous cash flow from the company. I think the thing that disappointed us greatly was this rejection in June, but that's life.
Nobody was more proud of your company than most Irish people. They were with you all the way. It's just a terrible, terrible setback. Nevertheless, it is a setback, and the shares are way down even as we speak.
I think at the end of the day, there's only one person to blame if something goes wrong in the company, that's the boss, and perhaps his advisors. But in this particular case, I think it was a combination of both of us.
I would say Tony was in absolutely no denial. He understood what his forward book of aircraft orders was. He understood he'd just had a giant failed flotation. He understood he couldn't do the aircraft securitization, and he understood the bank's maturities were staring him in the face.
In the United States, the huge American corporation General Electric were actively trying to take over GPA, and the banks and debtors were looking for their money. Everything seemed up for grabs, including Ryan's personal fortune and even Ryanair.
It is quite fair to say that, and it's still today, GE Credit, now GE Capital, and GE, we pay very close attention to opportunity.
The good news is there was sufficient cash flow to cover the debt. The bad news is you needed to attract new equity into the company.
Anne Lane, who was trying to get her money back for her banking group, a man called John Sharman, who was my predecessor actually in the end of the day as chairman of Aer Lingus, who was representing the Japanese banks. And they were all trying to get their piece, and we were sort of stuck in the middle, and we didn't have many cards to play, and it was pretty awful, actually.
I suspect it's fair to say that there were significant differences of opinion over time before the deal was actually consummated. From the team saying, wait a minute, there's a better way to do this.
There was a lot of drama of, we're out of here, deal stopped, trying to figure out where the line can be drawn.
Because Jack Welch of GE was now squeezing the company and actually trying to acquire the company, or trying to acquire most of the assets from the company. And when Tony, the famous line when Tony said, "Jack, you're raping me," and Jack said, "Yeah, you're walking around with no clothes."
After long and torturous negotiation, General Electric took control of GPA.
It eventually being sold in a deal that he thought was disastrous, and having to actually go and work for General Electric in the initial stages of GPA.
Here it was, we're the new owner, and he was our employee. Imagine. No, I mean, in human nature, and in particular for himself, I mean, that was very difficult. Now, he did it because he believed it was the only way out.
But he does take it very, very personally, and in particular, the way in which the banks come after him for the money which he owed them, which is well over 30 million in personal debt, which he has. And they are determined to get this back, and in particular, they try to get at Ryanair, which is not in his name, but is in the name of his children. And so he has to fight a rearguard action to make sure that the banks don't get to this, what will become his comeback project.
Aer Lingus, of course, was a major investor in GPA, and its failure on the stock markets gravely impacted upon the airline. The year 1992-93 would prove to be the worst year in the struggling airline's history, with annual losses of 100 million.
The GPA shares in the balance sheet of Aer Lingus actually meant quite a lot. And when the GPA IPO failed, Aer Lingus had a very weak balance sheet and needed to restructure their business. So I think that was the time when it really hit me that this was an airline, a company that had lost its way and really was going to struggle to survive if we didn't do things in a very different way.
Aer Lingus would suddenly realise that it could no longer go on in the old state company, ways. It had to become a modern, efficient company. It was a pretty moribund company commercially, and I think Ryanair made it realise it had to become much more commercial and much more efficient.
But amidst the chaos at GPA, Ryanair's prospects were beginning to turn around. With PJ McGoldrick now gone to set up his own charter airline, Transair, there was a new CEO at Ryanair, Conor Hayes, who began to change the airline into a low fares model. Alongside Hayes, Tony Ryan's former assistant, Michael O'Leary, was becoming increasingly involved in the business. Early in 1992, just before GPA's ill-fated flotation, Ryan dispatched O'Leary on a now somewhat mythical trip to the US.
We all went off to Love Field in Texas, which is the headquarters of Southwest. And it was run by an old friend of mine called Herb Kelleher.
If you're embarrassed to fly the airline with the fewest customer complaints in the country, Southwest will give you this bag. If, on the other hand, Southwest is your kind of airline, we'll still give you this bag. For all the money you'll save flying with us.
And Herb and Michael got on very well. And Michael had said he'd have a go at turning the airline around, and he came back from that visit as briefed a man as you could get.
And at some point in the process, it got to the decision that, well, look, if you can come up with a different formula, I'm prepared to give you a very significant piece of the equity. Now, can we hammer that out? And they hammered out some sort of an agreement that allowed O'Leary to become chief executive, but also become a very significant equity owner in the business. And that's when you start to see dramatic change in the business model.
And, we looked at everything. I mean, we got up every day and had a look, how can we shave more money off the business? How can we reduce costs further? And it came from everywhere. But it was driven, by Michael as chief executive. He set ambitious targets in terms of reducing costs. And we had to go out and look at our cost base, see where we could cut money. And it was an ongoing, continual process. It is still a process that continues to this day. In the 1970s, when I was growing up, and even into the 1980s, and when Ryanair was starting off, travel was the preserve of the well-off or the middle class, and many people didn't travel at all, and a lot of people had their first ever travel experience from Ryanair.
The deregulation of the European airways would also help to transform the fortunes of Ryanair across the continent.
Prior to that, Europe was controlled by the governments, and you needed to get government approval to fly on any particular route anywhere in Europe. But in 1997, just like what had happened to Southwest in the US, Europe deregulated.
I mean, you'd fly from one side of the United States to the other for less than it would take to fly between two reasonably proximate European capitals. The whole thing was crazy, and it had been allowed to be crazy. I took proceedings, legal proceedings, against 10 major airlines, all the major airlines, including Aer Lingus, for what was happening. And that began a trench warfare.
It was a logical flow from the free movement of capital, the free movement of goods, was the free movement of people and ultimately travel. And that, travel and air travel in particular was a way of doing that very, very, very quickly.
I remember the chief executive of Lufthansa coming to a dinner. I didn't know he was going to it, given by a former German commissioner in Brussels, just three of us sitting at a table, where I received a lecture from this man about, his name was Runau, about how I had no right or power to get involved in air transport. And I remember saying, we'll see.
While we're quick, I suppose, at some stages to criticise the European Union, it was the catalyst, and their ruling enabled us to grow in 1997, and we started to expand very, very rapidly.
As Ryanair went from strength to strength, Tony Ryan's fortunes were gradually restored. General Electric, who took over GPA, remain today headquartered in Shannon and are the largest leasing company in the world. But the collapse of GPA acted as a catalyst for the emergence of a new generation of young aviation leasing companies.
GPA was probably, I like to think of it as almost like a big tree that had many seeds that came off it. The tree itself passed on, but many of the seeds grew, and that really created a whole range of people, both in the industry itself, but also in advisors, accountancy firms, legal firms, who, technical services companies, who became expert in this area. And that, so there's a real critical mass here.
That has led to the development of over 30 aircraft leasing companies based in the Republic of Ireland that have become effectively the centre of aircraft leasing globally.
In 1993, the Irish Aviation Authority was set up, bringing together all the operational and regulatory functions under one umbrella. Alongside its role in air traffic control, the IAA's regulatory function would also enable the new leasing companies to operate in a credible environment that would become internationally recognised. This, allied to the support of successive governments, has cemented Ireland's dominant place in aviation leasing. While Ryanair was going from strength to strength, Aer Lingus was struggling with mounting costs and competition. But then, out of the blue, the world changed.
Firefighters, you should all report to your companies. Again, if you are a New York City firefighter,
I was at a meeting in the Aer Lingus boardroom when word came through that an aircraft had crashed into the Twin Towers. And I can remember watching on television, and I couldn't believe it. You're actually seeing this live, and you're questioning whether you've really seen what you have. And it was shocking. And I can remember standing there staring at this television and watching it over and over again, and then realizing that the world had changed and that the industry had changed. At the time, transatlantic business was about 50% of Aer Lingus revenues, and that just disappeared overnight. I've never seen anything like it, where people just stopped flying, and it created a crisis like we had never seen before. And O'Leary comes out and says, crisis, what crisis? This is the best opportunity he's ever had.
In the wake of 9/11, the airline business was in turmoil again. Ryanair seized the opportunity this presented, while Aer Lingus's new CEO, Willie Walsh, embarked upon a period of substantial change.
I became CEO. It was clear to everybody. I wasn't the first choice. I was the only choice. Nobody else wanted the job. And without hesitation, I said, yes, I'll do that. And I think I knew what needed to happen. I knew we were facing really, really tough times. And in a strange way, that made it easier, because for me it was either we changed or we died. And there was no other option. We either took real radical action or the business was gone. We looked at what Ryanair was doing, and we analysed their cost base in a way we had never analysed it before. And we tried to understand how they could do things at such a lower cost to Aer Lingus. So we quickly realised that there were aspects of our business that could change, make it much more efficient, and actually improve the customer service rather than reduce the customer service. And that's the way we approached it.
Walsh cut staff and costs aggressively at Aer Lingus and set about reinventing the national carrier as a low-fares airline.
The thing I asked the government to do at the time was to stand out of the way. They did give us some assistance, particularly in the area of insurance, because getting your aircraft insured after the events of 9/11 was impossible. So the Irish government ensured that we were able to insure our aircraft and therefore continue to operate. But I asked them to just stand back and let us get on with what needed to be done. And to be fair to them, they did that. You know, as we started succeeding and generating profitability, the interference certainly increased. The view that I had, you know, we needed to keep pushing through, making ourselves even more efficient. And we were facing strong opposition. And there was a strong view that we were changing the airline beyond where it needed to go. And at that point, we were finding, you know, more and more barriers trying to slow us down.
In order to escape what they viewed as the dead hand of public control, Walsh and his team floated the idea of privatising Aer Lingus. The Irish government, led by Taoiseach Bertie Ahern, were totally against this, and Walsh and his senior management resigned.
And the trigger point for me was when you know, I had a meeting with the Department for Transport, and I was told, look, you know, why don't you slow down, relax, and go off and play golf like other CEOs? And that, to me, was you know, the turning point.
In 1997, Ryanair was to be floated on the stock market. Although 5 years had passed since the GPA attempt, the shadow of its failure still hung over Tony Ryan. Inevitably, it became clear that Ryan would have to step aside.
I think you would not be human not to feel that at this great moment in your life that perhaps you weren't able to take the credit that you really deserved. I think that's just something that would be true for any of us.
At the end of May 1997, Ryanair was successfully floated on the Dublin and New York stock exchanges. For Tony Ryan, it was redemption of a kind, his family name forever etched in the annals of air travel.
When you think about Ryanair, started out, carried you know, a little less than 2 million passengers, now 79 million passengers, the biggest ultra low cost carrier in Europe, but the second largest operator of 737s in the world. Hugely important to us, tremendous relationship with Michael and the entire team. I mean, they've had great input in terms of our airplane performance and what we need to do.
Alongside Airbus, Boeing dominates aircraft production across the world. Today, Irish companies are among its leading customers, and in 2013, Ryanair placed an order for 175 planes, the largest ever order by a European company. O'Leary, as ever, drove a hard bargain.
I would say that Michael's fair. I think Michael does the best thing for Ryanair, but he keeps in mind that, you know, we ultimately have to get to a deal. And that's what we were able to do here just recently last year. And both he and I spent some solid time together and were able to come to a great solution for both of us. And 175 airplanes, yeah, he deserves to get a good deal.
With his fortune restored, Tony Ryan poured his considerable energies and resources into the arts, and into a restoration of another kind, that of his elegant 18th century home in County Kildare. It was here in 2007, Tony Ryan died. It was the end of an extraordinary life that changed the face of global aviation.
He was kind of a father figure, I think, to all the people in GPA. And so I felt a weird loss that this father figure was no more. That's how I took it.
The legacy of Tony Ryan is absolutely astonishing, and it is, you know, you don't want to use too strong terms, but it is in fact tectonic in terms of the way the world finances airplanes and buys them, and that is one of the biggest industries on Earth.
Today, Ireland is a truly global centre of aviation. Irish aviators have come a long way from those early days in Baldonnel and Foynes, Rhinana and Collinstown. Across the world, Irish people can be found heading up major international airlines, as well as investing substantially in new airlines. 8 of the 10 top leasing companies in the world are now based in Ireland.
Without its airplane industry, the balance of payments with the United States would be catastrophic. The same is true of, France, Germany. That is made possible today through the leasing industry. And if leasing didn't exist, that wouldn't happen.
Ireland dominates that industry worldwide. Irish-based leasing companies are the key and most strategically influential players in that industry worldwide.
I mean, this is an industry that will make, billions of dollars of profits this year globally, that will buy tens and hundreds of billions of dollars of assets, that will facilitate airlines around the world growing their business.
Either the CEO or the senior leaders in the majority of those, not all of them, are Irish, and most of them came from GPA.
Over time, over 1,000 airplanes have been ordered by Ireland. That's bigger than the Middle East, bigger than Africa, bigger than Latin America, bigger than South Asia in terms of a number of airplanes ordered. So yeah, it has a huge impact. And then when you think about, down the road, 1 in 5 airplanes, leased airplanes, are managed from Ireland. I just think it's inherent in the Irish culture. There's a history there. It's that pioneering spirit, I guess, and it penetrated into the United States. It's moved to everywhere in the world.
There is a consistent thread of vision, invention and determination throughout this epic tale of pioneers and aviators. As always, the stakes remain high and nothing is certain. But with no foreseeable end in sight, this story of Irish aviation continues to be written.